We'll move on to the next item of business, which is a statement by Michael Russell on reporting to Parliament on the Coronavirus Acts. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions following a statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak button. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, we all know that the coronavirus outbreak is unprecedented in our lifetimes and that it poses a severe and sustained threat to human life in Scotland. The human cost is only too apparent, not just in the tragedy of death, but also in illness, both physical and mental, and in the impact on all our lives. Jobs, businesses and the public service in Scotland have all been badly affected. Throughout our society, in every community, the magnitude of the challenge we have faced and continue to face is unique and extraordinary. And it has required extraordinary measures to meet that challenge, including here in this Parliament. In our collective role as leaders of Scottish society, we have a responsibility to ensure that we all take necessary steps to protect the lives of people living in Scotland and to support their livelihoods. And in our role as legislators, we have a duty to make sure that we act for the public realm, keeping our statute book fit for purpose and provide the powers needed to tackle the virus and its effects. In short, our job is to secure the legislative and regulatory tools that will help to overcome the problems we face and remove any obstacles to that task. The UK Coronavirus Act and the two Scottish Acts provided new measures to help protect the public, maintain essential public services and support the economy. These measures are and remain necessary because of the continuing severe public health and economic challenges posed by the pandemic. Back in early March this year, the Four Nations Coronavirus Action Plan outlined the collective approach and closely integrated planning processes which were put in place across these islands, including changes to legislation where needed, to help prevent the spread of the outbreak and to combat the impact and consequences of the virus. The provisions in the UK Coronavirus Act built on that plan and covered a range of topics and sectors, including bespoke provisions for Scotland to reflect our different legal system and our devolved areas, and these were subject to a separate LCM which passed this chamber. However, that Act, while laying reporting requirements on the UK Government every 2 months, did not do so for the devolved governments. The Coronavirus Scotland Act introduced further measures to support our own response here, and we took the opportunity then to institute formal reporting arrangements for the Scottish Government for the powers that the Act conferred. This Government will now report to this Parliament every 2 months on the continued necessity of all the measures in it and the use of the powers it contains. I also committed myself, when the first Scottish Act went through, to include the provisions of the UK Act as they related to Scotland in that reporting process. Today I have laid before Parliament the first report on the operation and continued necessity of the powers in both Acts. The report is a key plank in the Scottish Government's coronavirus strategy. Accountability is crucial to our work to suppress the virus. The report shows that the powers available to ministers have been used proportionately where it has been judged appropriate to do so, but that crucially they have not been used unless needed. That means that in some cases powers have not been commenced, as there is not a need to do so. More than 40 separate items are included in this first report. A great deal of work has been done within the Scottish Government, and I pay tribute to the team who have done it, and with our partners to compile a report that is clear and readable, but which maintains the proportionate approach we set out at the start of this process to avoid placing undue pressures at this time on those who are properly prioritising saving lives. Our approach also reflects the fact that measures in the legislation are of varying degrees of significance in terms of their impacts and the level of interest in their operation. Some measures, Presiding Officer, in the legislation are of greater significance in terms of their potential impacts on individuals or groups, or their implications for equality and human rights. Some are of significant interest to Parliament for other reasons. And we have sought, where possible, to provide detail over and above the reporting requirements set out in the Scottish Act on the operation of these powers. A central aspect of our reporting approach is the equality, human rights and children's rights impacts of the legislation. We recognise that the Parliament's Equalities and Human Rights Committee is particularly attentive to these matters in relation to the Government's response to this crisis, and as far as we can in our reporting, we have sought to examine those impacts and include or signpost to information, including in relation to equality and protected characteristics. But there is more work we wish to do here, and this will be one aspect where we seek to further develop our approach for future reports. Where the powers in the legislation have been used in the reporting period to support our response to the pandemic, there are already some very positive examples of the benefits of this. including, for example, suspension of pension scheme rules, which have allowed former NHS staff to return to frontline NHS roles, adding vital capacity to the workforce. The establishment of a temporary social work register had, at the end of the reporting period, seen over 200 registrants available to be deployed to frontline services. Powers included within the Scottish Act have allowed for easing of restrictions around civil, alcohol and non-alcohol licensing regimes, working to ensure that this unprecedented disruption doesn't cause anyone to lose their licence through no fault of their own. They've also enabled extensions to be granted to planning permission or planning permission in principle, should these lapse over the course of the emergency period. And we've been able to ease, temporarily, the reporting requirements imposed on some public bodies, where necessary, to enable them to direct their focus towards the efforts to respond to the emergency and to support, for example, access to documents by electronic means, where current social distancing restrictions mean that physical access is not possible. This report marks the beginning of our reporting process, with new measures having been in place for only a short time and new monitoring and reporting arrangements being established or in the process of being established to support their operation. We will continue to develop our reporting arrangements and keep the approach under review in response to the requirements of the Scottish Parliament. But in 2 instances, we have already responded to the views of committees and members about other items that should be included. In addition to the items from the second Scottish Coronavirus Act, our next report, which will be due following the end of the second reporting period on the 31st of July, will include information on SSIs, where their primary purpose relates to coronavirus. This follows the amendment during the second bill process originally proposed by Adam Tompkins and reflecting the views of the DPLR committee. The second report will also take into account available information from the Scottish Police Authority or Police Scotland about the nature and the number of incidents of domestic abuse during each reporting period. This reflects the amendment brought forward by Pauline McNeill to help inform the approach taken to domestic abuse during the outbreak, also as part of the second Scottish Bill. Scottish ministers will, of course, continue to be answerable to Parliament for how the Scottish Government is responding to the pandemic, including the use of these statutory powers. Let me conclude by noting that, as required by Section 15 of the Coronavirus Scotland Act, ministers have conducted a review of the provisions in Part 1 of that Act and have prepared this report. We are satisfied that the status of the provisions set out in Part 1 of the Act remains appropriate. A review has also been conducted of the provisions of the UK Act to which the Scottish Parliament gave legislative consent, and these are also covered within the report. We are satisfied that the status of the provisions in the UK Act to which the Scottish Parliament gave its legislative consent remains appropriate. We now look forward to and welcome the opportunity of engagement with the Parliament as it considers its first report. Presiding Officer, the crisis we are going through is not as yet ended, but I can give one final assurance to the Parliament. When it is, these acts will not be needed and will be immediately set aside. Moreover, we will take any and every opportunity we can to set aside some of the provisions of these acts, even if the whole of the acts cannot be rescinded, whenever it is safe to do so. And in that connection, I'm pleased to be able to inform the Chamber that the use of one provision has already been revoked. On the 11th of May 2020, the Minister for Public Health, Sport and Wellbeing signed a direction which revoked the use of the provision on the suspension of death certification review. We are, Presiding Officer, in exceptional times. These are exceptional measures. All of us want those times to be over, and with them these measures, which are born only out of necessity.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. We'll now move to questions. The first from Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and for advance sight of it, and welcome the publication of the 2-month report. This is a detailed publication with a great deal of information, which MSPs and others will want to take time to absorb and consider carefully. At this stage, I would like to ask the Cabinet Secretary about the police enforcement of the health protection regulations, which restrict individuals' behaviour. The latest statistics from Police Scotland indicate that around 5,000 such notices have been issued, declining from a peak in early April, indicating that whilst there has been overall very high levels of public compliance with the regulations, nevertheless there is a persistent minority who continue to flout the rules and put themselves and others at risk. In evidence to the Policing Subcommittee this morning, the Scottish Police Federation said that in relation to restrictions on travel, entering someone else's house or on the question of quarantine on return from holidays, such measures are nigh on impossible to enforce. I have also been told that in rural areas such as Perthshire, the local police have been advised not to take any action in relation to individuals moving between first and second homes, even though this causes real concern in these communities and is a breach of the regulations. I'm sure that the Cabinet Secretary will understand the frustration this causes. So can I ask him, what is his view on having these regulations continuing in operation if the police are not able to enforce them?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, first of all, I thank Murdo Fraser for his welcoming of the report, and I look forward to discussing it with his committee. There is, of course, always a balance to be struck between what is in legislation and what is in guidance. And Police Scotland have been involved in the development of legislation and guidance, I have to say. And we have the absolute confidence in Police Scotland and their ability and professionalism to support the measures in place. They're keeping the people of Scotland safe at a very different time, and the surveys show a very strong support for the policing in Scotland during the pandemic. Now, the Chief Constable has always made it clear that it's important that the policing tone and style reflects the need for positive engagement and common sense. And the vast majority of people have complied with the rules and continue to comply with the rules. And the rules are not there simply to impose upon people. They are there to save lives. I drove through early this morning to this Parliament, and the message is still there on the motorway gantries. It is about staying at home and saving lives. And we need to reinforce that all the time. And we also need to be able to say to our neighbours and to our friends that observing the rules in that way remains absolutely essential. Now, I'm sure the police will continue to underwrite that too, to try and engage in their 4E strategy, to try and explain to people why this is important, but I'm sure they will enforce the regulations as they are. And the regulations are in place and can be enforced. And I don't think we should send out from this chamber any other message but the fact that the regulations are enforced and can be and will be enforced if that is required.
Alec Rowley.
Yeah, thank you. The report is a welcomed report, and there is a fair amount of detail in here, as others have said, that MSPs will want to look at. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary a couple of points? One is that in terms of some of the powers that were brought in to take the pressure off local authorities, so for example in assessments, etc. Will there be more detailed information to be brought either back here through this report or to a committee? So for example, before we had the COVID crisis, assessment waiting times for care packages were already in some authorities completely out of control. So goodness knows where they are now. So I think what we also need to know is what the impact of these powers have been in terms of the example I give there, growing waiting lists for assessments for care packages. And can I also ask in terms of looking forward, we have the 2 COVID bills that have come here, but in areas such as risk assessment in workplaces, health and safety, if we start to see the R number go up, is he willing to take further steps to look at what the response has been to risk assessments in workplaces, health and safety reps, and indeed collective bargaining across the whole of the care sector?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Alec Rowley for those 2 questions and for his welcome for the report, and I'm sure we'll have the chance to discuss it. In terms of the powers, sections 16 and 17 of the Act address the duty of the local authority to assess needs, and section 16 was also about further provision. Now, there is a comprehensive section in the report on this that provides additional new information. And we do now know that in the use of those powers, and we've surveyed 26 out of the 32 local authority areas, 6 did not respond, we do now know that 5 partnership areas comprising 6 local authorities used these powers during the period. So the vast majority of local authorities did not use these powers. So the data that we have here adds to, supplements, but does not replace the data then about how existing legislation is being used. So we're adding an additional level of data focused specifically on how this is used. I think when we see next time the figures for how the ordinary legislation is used, that will tell us something about whether this is helping local authorities to meet those targets or whether it's failing to do so. It's also interesting, as the member will find out from the report when he reads it in full, that in this area, some local authorities have used the powers across the whole area. Some are targeting them very carefully, perhaps, and we will have to set that against the other data, perhaps in areas where they were performing worst. So I think it's going to take a lot of work to look at the data, to compare that data, and to work out what is happening. But we have the data here. We will have more data, because we're keen that this particular area is one of the areas where we continue to add to the data that we have. In terms of safe workplaces, can I repeat assurances that I've given the member before, that I gave Colin Smythe in the passage of the second bill? There is an absolute legal right to a safe workplace. That there's no ifs and buts. Nothing we've done in legislation does anything other than reinforce that fact. And if there is not a safe workplace, people should not be in that workplace and must not be in that workplace. And it is the act of utter irresponsibility of an employer to expect them to be in that workplace, and there are legal remedies available so that people do not have to do that. Now, the member asked me if we would undertake further legislation. We have done 2 emergency bills. I have to say that is a lot in 2 months. But of course, if there was any issue that we required to return to this chamber with and to legislate on, we would do so. Now, I hope we won't have to do so, but if we required to do so, we would do so. I do hope that's not necessary, but the issue he raises and other issues, if that became something that was essential, of course we would act on it.
Thank you. Andy Whiteman, to be followed by Alex Cole-Hamilton.
Thanks, Presiding Officer, and thank Cabinet Secretary Van Sight of the report. It's a long report, of course. It will take some time to digest. In paragraph 7.1.1.8, it talks about the establishment of the private rented sector resilience group in the context of housing. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary who's on this group? Who, if any, represents tenants, and if none, why not? When was it established? How often is it meeting? And will the agenda minutes and papers be published?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I think what I have to say to Andy Whiteman is that I would require to have that information and to get it sent to him. I do not have this information in the report, but I think the fact that it has been set up is an indication of the serious intent of the Scottish Government to make sure that work is done and continues to be done on the provisions in the bill. And I just want to stress that. This is not in any sense about the things that didn't make it through into legislation. This is about the things that made it through into legislation and then how they are operating, what's taking place. So if the member will allow me to, I will ensure that the questions he has asked are noted and that we have answers for him in writing to them. I thought the member might also want to ask me about his Muirburn provision, which I'm happy to say, if he looks up, can be reactivated in October, because there's another possibility of Muirburn at that time. But he will no doubt want to note that from the report and perhaps come back to me about that being one of the things he did get through the Act when he proposed it.
Alex Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I appreciate the provisions in Schedule 9 on the temporary modification of mental health legislation have not yet been commenced. 2 of the most controversial elements of the bill are to be found in those provisions. Firstly, increasing emergency detention on grounds of mental ill health from 72 to 120 hours, and removing the need of a medical practitioner to consult a mental health officer before the imposition of a short-term detention certificate. These were passed in good faith because at the time this Parliament had no idea what the demands on the NHS were going to be. It is now not clear why they would ever be needed, because we know that the capacity strain, even in the event of a second wave, does not impact prohibitively on this arm of the health service. Does he recognise the view of my party and human rights organisations that these provisions are unnecessary, potentially illiberal, and should now be repealed as soon as possible?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank Alex Cole-Hamilton for his question. I mean, I expressed my own concern about these provisions when the legislative consent motion went through, and I'm sure I'm on record as doing so. But I'm not a psychiatrist, and indeed Alex Cole-Hamilton is not a psychiatrist, but fortunately I have the words of a psychiatrist in front of me. And no mean psychiatrist, I have to say, Professor John Crichton, the chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists in Scotland. And unfortunately he contradicts directly what Alex Cole-Hamilton has said. Let me just read, if I might, a paragraph from it. Up to this point, while there have been significant workforce impacts, our members have been able to cope. This is what Mr Cole-Hamilton says, but then he went on. In spite of evidence heard by the committee on the 28th of May, though, there remains a real possibility that these workforce pressures will come to bear later in the year. The real risk of a second spike alongside an expected post-lockdown increase in severe mental health cases would have the potential for a reduction in the mental health workforce to the point they cannot operate mental health legislation in a normal way, placing vulnerable patients at risk. The decision to enact these emergency measures in such a scenario would need to be taken quickly in response. To not have these measures immediately available in such a situation could lead to patients facing unnecessary delays to treatment and resulting harm. We would therefore call for the committee, that is the Qualities Committee, to reconsider its recommendation on Schedule 9. So I have to say, I have to disagree with Mr. Cole-Hamilton. I was concerned about these. We would all remain concerned about these. But when in doubt about an issue to do with mental health, it's quite useful to listen to a psychiatrist, let alone the chair of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and he appears to be entirely clear about the matter.
Annabel Ewing to be followed by Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The additional supplement to the carers allowance provided for in the legislation will represent a lifeline for hard-working carers right across Scotland. Can the Cabinet Secretary advise as to how many carers are expected to benefit from this additional funding?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I'm grateful to the member for that question. The carer supplement was dealt with in Schedule 1, Part 3 of the Coronavirus Scotland No. 2 Act, of which we are not reporting at this present moment, as it's only just been passed. That will come into the reporting process due by the 31st of July. I can, however, say that there will be an investment of about 19.2 million, and the estimate that it will support about 83,000 carers with the additional cost of caring during the pandemic. So I hope that answers the question, but more detailed information on what is in the second act and reporting on that will happen in the next reporting period.
Thank you. Adam Tompkins to be followed by Ruth McGuire. Adam Tompkins.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know that the government's route map talks about allowing marriages to take place in phase 2, and I know that we're not yet in phase 2, but the route map is not law. The law requires that Scottish ministers must take steps, and must take steps now, with the Registrar General to ensure that marriages can go ahead compatibly with the right to marry under Article 12 of the European Convention. So can I ask what such steps have Scottish ministers taken to date, and when will they report to Parliament on what those steps have achieved?
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Tompkins, I know, has shown a particular interest in this subject, and I commend it because I think it is a very serious and important subject. I explained to him last week when he asked the very similar question at the committee that I think that two things have happened. One of which is that emergency marriages have continued, and indeed I've been helpful, and I know he has been helpful to people who have sought those emergency marriages, and that has been one step forward. The second one is in the route map, that the route map now says that marriages will recommence, and it does so in a proportionate and sensible way, bearing in mind all the difficulties and pressures and the judgments that have to be reached about each item. I am very hopeful that that will be not long delayed, and therefore that will have brought it forward, and the pressure that Professor Tompkins has put on this and others have put on this will result in marriages taking place sooner than they otherwise would have done, and I think that's very important.
Ruth McGuire to be followed by James Kelly. Ruth McGuire.
Presiding Officer, measures in these bills have greatly reduced homelessness. The Equalities and Human Rights Committee heard from the Homeless Network Scotland that rough sleeper numbers are down to about 30. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary what the Scottish Government will do to ensure that we don't go backwards once these bills expire?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think all of us will share that view. I think that has been a useful and very helpful step forward. Everybody regrets how it has happened, but I think it is something that we should say has been effective, and we want to continue to be effective. I know that the Minister has addressed this chamber on that issue and will do so again. I would simply ask him to, I'll ask him to write to the member with further details, but the intention, I know, is to make sure it does not happen again. That is out with the purview of this legislation and this report, because this report is about what we did and how we changed the legislation within this Parliament. What happens next would obviously require, and does require, a continued effort under existing legislation and possibly under new rules and legislation. So I'll ask him to give that in detail to the member, but I think we would all agree that that is something that has to happen.
Thank you. James Kelly to be followed by Fulton McGregor.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. For emergency legislation to be effective, it requires proper consultation with stakeholders in Parliament. It's therefore regrettable that the Scottish Police Federation, in a submission to the Justice Policing Subcommittee, have said that the consultation was too little in regard to the new regulations. Does the Cabinet Secretary therefore accept that as we move through the different phases of emerging through lockdown, that there must be a more effective effort to work with stakeholders like the Scottish Police Federation on new regulations?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'd want to address that question in two parts. The first part is, by definition, emergency legislation is emergency. So you can't undertake the full consultation you would normally wish to take in any bill. So I think one just has to accept that that is a truncated process. People do what they can do, they listen to what they can get hold of, and they try very hard to get balanced legislation. Of course, as time goes on, people have the opportunity to give information, they have the opportunity to give views. I would doubt there is a member in this chamber that has not heard in detail from a whole range of organisations about a whole range of issues to do with the current regulations and how they may change and how they may develop. And that is also part of the consultation. And I'm sure members have made those representations, as have many bodies. Many bodies have made those representations, and officials are still regularly talking to organisations about how to take forward. So, of course, there needs to be continued discussion, because that's the basis of the confidence in regulations. But when you start on the process of emergency legislation, particularly as we had to do a major LCM and 2 bills in something less than 8 weeks, then clearly it is not going to be the same nature of consultation as it would be for a piece of legislation that may take 6 to 8 months to a year or longer to develop, and then 9 months to go through this chamber. That quite clearly you're talking about 2 different processes.
Fulton McGregor, to be followed by Oliver Mundell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A range of the powers in these bills are intended to prevent delays and backlogs in the justice system. So, moving on a bit from James Kelly's previous question, can the Cabinet Secretary advise whether these measures are proving to be effective in terms of mitigating delays and enabling our justice system to continue to function effectively?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think the member will discover in the report, when he has the pleasure of reading it, that there is detail given on all the legal provisions within the bill, and they would indicate where those have been used, which is in the majority of cases, and how they are regarded as being effective. And I think the conclusion to be reached is that these measures have been effective. Some clearly are not going to operate as fully as you would expect if, for example, there are no jury trials taking place. But what we have here are the measures that were felt to be required immediately to make a difference. And I think the report indicates that in almost all the cases, those have made a difference, small or large, but have made a difference and have served their purpose and will continue to serve their purpose. And I should stress that point. Some of these changes are only kicking in now as the issues of the pandemic develop, and therefore one should look in the next report and perhaps in the report after that for a continued utility for some and perhaps less of a usage of others.
Oliver Mundell, to be followed by Shona Robertson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I know there's some commentary in the report, but given that the prisoner release process has finished, can the Cabinet Secretary explain why these powers have not yet been revoked, and can he confirm that there are no plans to release further prisoners?
Cabinet Secretary.
As far as I'm aware, the report here is completely up to date. I think the question of whether there would be any further release is unlikely given the criteria that are applied. But I want the member to have that assurance from the Cabinet Secretary for Justice rather than myself, and I shall ask him to give it to him. But the issue in here is how the powers have been used. Whether those powers come to an end will require, I think, a recommendation from the Justice Secretary, and no doubt he will want to consult and probably consult the Justice Committee on those matters too. But the report in here is about how they have been used, the criteria, which also involves those number of prisoners who have not been granted early release for reasons given in the report.
Shona Robertson, to be followed by Monica Lennon. Shona Robertson.
Thank you. Staying at home has been a vital part of preventing the spread of the virus. Measures to increase housing security have been an important part of enabling this. So can the Cabinet Secretary advise whether the emergency measures to increase housing security are proving to be effective? And can he advise how levels of rent arrears are being monitored to ensure that measures remain in place for as long as necessary?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yes, I think that the report contains useful detail that indicates that the measures have been not only well received but well used and will continue to be so. I know that the Minister, Kevin Stewart, will want to look at and is looking at the continued use of these powers and how much longer they would be required to be used. And I think quite clearly, given what we know presently, there will need to be these powers in place for some further period of time, and the Minister at the appropriate moment will be able to come to the Chamber and make those recommendations.
Monica Lennon to be followed by Gillian Martin. Monica Lennon.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I welcome the report and in particular the information that pages 56 and 57 on social work assessments, but I'm disappointed that not all local authorities replied to the survey. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary if he can provide a list of the local authorities who have used the legislation and to tell us the authorities who didn't reply to the survey, please?
Cabinet Secretary.
I can certainly give the member the list of authorities which did not reply, and those are, I regret to say, Argyll and Bute, Falkirk, Highland, Inverclyde and Scottish Borders. Those are the ones we did not hear from, and I know officials will be in touch with them. Of those who are using the powers, 2 local authorities, East Renfrewshire and Dundee, provided information on numbers of assessments and comparator data, so that they went further than they need to go. I think that it's perfectly possible, and I don't seem to have the information here, that I can provide the committee, of which Monica Lennon is the Vice Chair, with information on the local authorities who are using them. I can't see any difficulty in that. And perhaps we can flesh that out if the committee wishes to ask further questions about this section. I think this section is reassuring in the sense that I remember Monica Lennon asked me questions about this when the bill was going through, and I think there was a fear, which I shared with her, that it would be more widely used than it appears to have been used to date, and I stress to date, because there is an issue to be addressed there. But I'm sure we can give you that information, and I have now given you the information of the ones who have not responded, and I'll make sure that officials try and get some information from them.
And Gillian Martin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's understandable that powers have been given to local authorities to exclude the public from meetings on health grounds. However, it is vital that our democracy is transparent, and I note that Aberdeenshire Council have been putting all policy committees' recordings online throughout the lockdown and are streaming live from tomorrow. Has the Scottish Government engaged with all local authorities to encourage interim measures such as video broadcast of meetings?
Cabinet Secretary.
The member makes a very important point. In a sense, we have also excluded members of the public from our meetings because the galleries are closed, and therefore we have done no more than local authorities we have empowered local authorities to do. But of course, our proceedings are being broadcast live. They are recorded verbatim. I'm sure that's not the most exciting read all of the time, but they are there if people want to read them. And in those circumstances, I would definitely believe the local authorities should pay heed to that and ensure that if they do not have members of the public there, and they cannot have members of the public there, quite clearly, in terms of social distancing at the present moment and other restrictions, they should be very transparent in those proceedings, how they operate, and the proceedings also of emergency committees which do exist in some local authorities to undertake business. I don't think this is a burden, I think it's a necessity, and certainly we would encourage every local authority to recognise that.
Thank you very much. That concludes this item of business. I'm going to move on shortly to a debate on COVID-19, the next steps. There'll just be a short pause while we change seats.